Recording in progress. And there it is. Okay. So you can all be expecting an email after that. In terms of any questions that you might have as we go along today, we're going to encourage you to utilize the chat function that's here in Zoom, and just be sure to address the whole group when you do put those questions into the chat function. You can either do that, or you can also just direct it to one or all of our 3 moderators that are here today. We're going to do our best to answer these questions with the chat as we go along, but we may also reserve or sort of revisit those questions for the Q&A session at the end. And we're going to ask that any participants that are dialing in today by phone, just to kind of reserve those questions for the end as well, just to sort of not interrupt the flow of the presentation. So on to the next slide here. So just in case anyone here is unfamiliar with us, and excuse, my phone is of course ringing right now. This is just a sort of quick note about our organization. VCLF is a nonprofit community development financial institution. And our goal here is to kind of serve communities, businesses, and individuals in the lending industry. If you're interested in learning more about us, our organization, our loan products, our services, just feel free to visit the website that we have up here, or you can reach out to any one of us. This is our contact information as well. And so with that, on the call today, we have Emma Enoch, who is one of our esteemed loan officers. And presenting, we're going to have Ben Green, who is our business navigator and one of my fellow advisors in the Business Resource Center. Both Ben and Emma particularly have been working tirelessly on all things PPP related of late. And I think you'll find their insight and their sort of experiences to be invaluable in this process. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to pass this along to Ben and chat for any questions that you might have as they arise. And so I'm going to say, take it away, Ben.
Hey, everybody. So, as Corey just introduced me, I'm Ben Green. Just want to thank everybody again for joining us today. And hopefully everybody can kind of take something useful away from this. So we're kind of planning on running through the forgiveness gauntlet today. We'll talk about the applications themselves, the forgiveness calculation and what expenses you should be including in it, the documentation that might not necessarily be needed for most applicants, but we'll strongly advise you to hold on to, and what the process should look like from your perspectives. And as Corey mentioned, we'll also have some time at the end for Q&A, but just to reiterate, as questions come to mind throughout the call, feel free to send them out in the group. So there are a couple of big updates that I just want to mention right off the bat. They've changed the forgiveness process quite a bit since VCLF's last presentation on the topic. The most noticeable is the new forgiveness application, which should benefit small and micro business owners a ton. The application is called the 3508S. It's been reduced to 1 page, and it requires way less information than both the PPP loan application and then the original forgiveness application as well. The other big update, which is still kind of tied into the 3508S, is that you are no longer required to submit supporting documentation proving how the loan was spent. Again, this is just for the 3508S. And we still, and I'll say this many times throughout the call, cannot recommend enough that every business keeps all the affiliated documentation for at least a 40-year window. We'll get into both of these developments a bunch more throughout the call, but they are kind of 2 key points that I wanted to highlight here at the top, given their significance. And then one more note, it's not necessarily an update, but it's something that a couple of you might have seen, and I just wanted to provide some clarity on, are the changing circumstances around PPP loans being taxed as income by the state of Vermont. So over the past 6 weeks or so, there's been some back and forth within the state legislature on the topic. As of May 14th, though, they decided not to retroactively tax PPP loans that were forgiven within 2021 as income due to Frankly, a ton of pushback publicly from business associations and then from individual organizations throughout the state. These groups successfully argued that the tax would not only disproportionately impact the small and micro businesses who got way more access to the program in 2021, but it also just went against the founding principles of PPP. So one of the first questions you all might have is, which forgiveness application should I be using? Which is totally understandable, since the SBA has come out with new versions on a pretty regular basis. And while some of you may have gone through the forgiveness process already with your first draw, it could be different this time around. The good news is that answering the question should be pretty straightforward for most, if not all of you. So right now, the most commonly used form, which is also the quickest and the easiest, and the form I already mentioned, is the 3508S. The form was created by the SBA in January 2021, and borrowers are allowed to use it so long as their loan was less than $150,000, no ifs, ands, or buts. I'll be referencing the 3508S on the next couple of slides, but I do just want to quickly mention the two alternatives. So the second most preferable slide is, or application, sorry, is the 3508EZ form. It should be used for any forgiveness applicants who received a loan that was greater than $150,000, and they either did not reduce their staff by more than 25% from January 1st, 2020, or they had to reduce their staff as part of compliance with the CDC or Secretary of Health's COVID health guidelines. The 3508EZ application does require supplemental documents to be submitted that verify both payroll and non-payroll expenditures that the business would be looking to get forgiven. The application is still only a couple of pages long, I think 3 or 4 in total. And it was the SBA's second attempt at a forgiveness application that was supposed to be easier than the original, hence the easy name. The original application, and arguably the least user-friendly, I'd say, is the 3508. It easily dwarfs the two aforementioned applications, both in terms of length and complexity. It also requires those supplemental documents. So if possible, try to avoid that one. At the same time, VCLF has filled out a couple of those applications before. We are relatively familiar and comfortable with them and would be happy to help. So this is the 3508S form, and to the surprising credit of the federal government, it's really simplified the forgiveness process for all of PPP's smallest borrowers. So what you're seeing on this page right here is pretty much everything you need to complete, with the exception of your signature, which I figured we didn't need to all stare at. If you do have the necessary information on hand, you should be able to complete it within a matter of minutes. Like I mentioned before, though, and I will mention again, an exciting new feature of this application is that no documentation is required to prove how the loan was spent, and no supporting calculations are required to prove how you arrived at your forgiveness amount. As a very friendly reminder, though, if you do knowingly lie on any of these documents and you are audited, there is the potential for a fine of up to $250,000 and the possibility of even 5 years of jail time. So please avoid that. 2 pieces of information that you will need to get from your lender include the SBA PPP loan number and the lender PPP loan number. Otherwise, all the business information that this form is asking for should be pretty easy to track down, and a lot of it was even used on your actual PPP loan application. One additional thing I actually want to note, the PPP loan disbursement date is just the date in which the loan was deposited into your bank account. The easiest way to track that down is just to go through your bank statements and look for the date in which you got a big deposit. You can tell this is the 3508 application by both the lack of spaces where you need to fill in information, but also because of the labeling in the form's header. The application is pretty easy to track down. It's the first link that pops up when you just Google 3508S PPP forgiveness application. If you are struggling to find it for any reason, though, feel free to reach out to a member of VCLF and we'll happily pass it along. If you do go ahead and pull the application from the SBA's website yourself, though, you'll see once you get onto that web page a big red download PDF button. Don't worry about all the different versions that you'll see lower down on the web page. They're just different releases that have come about throughout the year and have slight variations. But that big red button should automatically take you to whatever the most recent edition is. So here's a quick review of what eligible expenses can be forgiven. Not only were they listed out on the PPP loan application themselves, they'll also be listed out on the forgiveness application. The primary one is obviously payroll, which includes wages and tips, up to $100,000 for each employee. Any employee benefits like healthcare and unemployment that you might be paying for, business rent or mortgage interest payments, any utility bills, any supplier costs that are both essential to the business and predate when you receive the PPP loan, and then any operational changes that were made to either help comply with COVID guidelines or just you took the initiative on and did to help improve employee protection. An additional expense that can be forgiven, I don't know how applicable it'll be for most of you, that I didn't include in this slide is the property damage costs caused by vandalism and looting from public disturbances in 2020. For those costs to be eligible, though, they couldn't have been covered by insurance or any other form of compensation, really. Calculating forgiveness. First and foremost, the amount of your loan that can be forgiven is dependent on what the funds were used for. So for most borrowers, if all funds were used for the eligible purposes we just walked through, and at least 60% of the funds were spent on payroll costs, you can apply for full forgiveness. For borrowers with a loan that was greater than $150,000 to receive full forgiveness, you also couldn't have reduced hourly wages by more than 25% for any employee, and you could not have reduced the number of employees. If any of these requirements were not met, there will unfortunately be some math involved, and I'm happy to talk about specific instances during our Q&A time or even later on a one-on-one call, but generally speaking, you will need to reduce the forgivable loan amount you apply for, so you're complying with the requirements I just kind of walked through. A quick and easy way to figure out how much of your loan is forgivable is to take your payroll expenditures and divide them by 0.6. If this number is greater than your total PPP loan amount, then you should be eligible for full forgiveness, of course, assuming your other funding just went towards other eligible expenses. If this number is less than your total loan amount, then it equals your total forgivable loan amount. So an example is, let's say your PPP loan was $100. You only spent $50 on payroll costs. You would take 50 and divide it by 0.6, which roughly comes out to 83. Obviously, 83 is less than $100, so you would only be eligible for $83 worth of forgiveness. Another example, which is slightly different, let's say you had spent $75 out of your $100 loan on payroll, which obviously exceeds that 60% threshold, but the other $25 would put towards ineligible expenses because, you know, one day you got thirsty and wanted to visit your local brewer. You would only be able to apply for $75 worth of forgiveness. So non-required documents, that was my lame attempt to be cheeky, I guess. So I think everybody on this call is going to be eligible to use the 3508S forgiveness application, which again does not require your business to supply any supporting documents to prove how you spent your loan. However, the application does specifically ask for all borrowers to keep payroll documentation for at least 4 years after forgiveness, and for all non-payroll documentation to be kept for at least 3 years. Theoretically, the SBA can audit any borrower during this time period to prove they spent their funds as were indicated on the forgiveness form. Frankly, we think the likelihood of an audit occurring for any business with a loan that was, in the 4 or 5 figure range to be pretty unlikely. Nevertheless, we still could not recommend enough that you keep all applicable documents in the off chance the SBA comes knocking. Some examples of these documents include your payroll reports, your tax filings. If you were just paying yourself, maybe bank statements proving the payroll expenditures, as well as any invoices or payment records you might have related to your interest payments, your rent, your lease, your utilities, those operations expenditures we had mentioned before, or really any of the other eligible expenses we have already talked about. Here is a abbreviated timeline of what the forgiveness process is going to look like from a borrower's perspective. There are a couple of caveats for when you can actually start the process though. So first, you have to have spent the entirety of your PPP loan, which was supposed to happen basically anywhere from 8 to 24 weeks after the loan was deposited into your bank account. Secondly, if you have received 2 PPP loans, you must have gotten the first draw forgiven before you can apply for forgiveness on your more recent draw. Once you are done spending your loan, though, you have a 10-month, for lack of a better term, I'll call it a grace period, where your loan payments are essentially delayed. The grace period is supposed to be the window where you apply for forgiveness. However, if the 10-month period does lapse, you can still apply for forgiveness at any point, but you won't be able to retroactively collect the loan payments you've started to make. And just as a reminder, the loan is intended, if it's not forgiven, to be repaid over a 5-year period with a minimal interest rate tacked on. To start, we do recommend gathering the necessary info to complete the form. So like I mentioned, that'll include reaching out to VCLF or whoever your respective lender was for your SBA PPP loan number and your lender PPP loan number. If you'd like, VCLF or again, your respective lender can also provide a copy of your original PPP application in the off chance you're having a hard time tracking down any of the business information the forgiveness form is asking for. Once the application is completed, please go ahead and send it along to vclf@vclf.org. We will confirm the receipt of your application with a response, and then we'll go ahead and check it over, make sure everything looks great, to the best of our ability at least. If anything does look off, we will ask for either additional documents or some clarifying information. If not, though, we will go ahead and submit the application to the SBA, who ultimately has final say on both the acceptance of the application and also determines the forgivable loan amount. The SBA can take anywhere up to 90 days to respond to your forgiveness application. We are expecting it to take a bit less time than that, though. VCLF will also let you know when the SBA makes their final decision. That'll be posted in the same portal that we end up submitting your application through. And just as a side note, so long as your application is pending, or in other words, you've submitted it to the SBA, but you're waiting for them to make a final decision on it, you will not need to start making payments on your loan. So even if you end up breaching that 10-month grace period, so long as the application is still ongoing or the review is still ongoing, you don't need to start making repayments. And then also, if the SBA does ask a question about the application, just because the information provided was insufficient or they just want to double check or anything, the 90-day clock will end up resetting for the SBA. If you aren't satisfied with the SBA's decision, you will have the ability to appeal their verdict. The process occurs with the Office of Hearings and Appeals, also known as the OHA, and it has to happen within 30 calendar days after receiving the SBA's notification. Your appeal is going to be a little bit more of an in-depth process than the initial forgiveness application. It's going to require a copy of the decision you're appealing, a written statement from you explaining why you think the SBA's decision was incorrect, the forgiveness amount that you feel like you deserve, as well as signed copies of your payroll tax filing, your state quarterly employee wage reportings, and your unemployment insurance tax filing. So once you have all those documents in place, you can go ahead and send them along to the Associate General Counsel for litigation, and they are just located at the SBA's DC office. So that's kind of the end of our little slide deck. If anybody does have any questions that you have yet to ask, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself or virtually raise your hand or whatnot, and yeah, we'll do our best to answer.
Don't be shy, everyone. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen as well.
Well, I'll just go ahead and read out the one question that looks like was sent out in the thread in case anybody else was wondering the same thing, or it inspires any other questions. So it looks like somebody asked, does the forgiveness application need to be submitted to the bank or lender your PPP loan was issued through? And it looks like Emma already jumped on that, but yes, it does.
I've got a question. Hi. I don't know why my video is not working, but my microphone is. So I guess in terms of documentation, so just having writing myself a check each week as payroll, that is showing that I'm spending the money rather than okay.
Exactly. And again, you won't need to, when you end up applying for forgiveness through BCLF, you won't need to show us those bank statements or checks or anything like that. It's just in the off chance that the SBA wants to kind of verify that what you said on your application was what you actually did. They might ask you for some bank statements or something like that. But
Okay.
that would be all you would really need if you used your entire loan for you.
Okay. I think that was it.
All right. It looks like we might have a couple more in the chat too. So is there anything additional to know or do for seasonal businesses? So one thing the application is going to end up asking you is for your current number of employees. For that, Emma, correct me if I'm wrong, you'll basically end up using whatever the current amount of people that you're paying is, which should be, again, not that you'll necessarily need to verify it, but down the road, if you do, you could probably end up just generating a 941 or something like that for this particular window that you were using your loans during as a statement or verification of how you spend your funds. What about sole proprietor with no EEs? I'm assuming EEs stands for other employees or something. So if you are a sole proprietor with no other employees and you were still using the loan for payroll, like Susan kind of indicated, there were a couple of ways to go about paying yourself, depending on what you've done historically. If you have actually still set up a payroll provider, maybe you're just doing owner's draws or something like that. But simply having the statements showing that the loan was essentially moving from one bank account to another, whether that was from a business account to a personal account or even a checking account to a savings account, that should be sufficient in terms of proving how the loans were spent. It looks like Kevin asks, would you clarify how to determine the cover period, 8 to 24 weeks? So for most borrowers, when VCLF initially ended up sending you closing documents, the automatic default was to have this cover period last 24 weeks, which, to be fair, that was us trying to give everybody as much time as possible to spend the loans over. What the SBA had kind of been requesting initially is that PPP funding was used over anywhere from an 8 to 24 week period. So you weren't just kind of taking one big lump sum and paying yourself with it all right off the bat. What it ultimately ends up meaning, though, is the period in which you spent the funds over. So it doesn't matter if it was 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 15 weeks, whatever that window ended up being was your cover period. And as soon as those funds end up running out, that's essentially when your cover period is over. If anybody else has anything else, feel free to throw it out. All right, I think we might be all set for today then. Again, I just want to thank everybody for hopping on the call today. I know it's not easy to do it in the middle of a work day. In case anybody missed any of the contact info that was listed out earlier in the presentation, you can feel free to reach out via email to me at ben@vclf.org. I'm happy to set up a follow-up call or just email back and forth. Oh, it looks like somebody's hand might have been raised that I blew by.
Hi, this is Nora.
Hey, Nora.
I had a question about responsibility for repayment. It's crazy in the shop right now, and I have the feeling that it will be crazy in the 8 to 24 week period after which my loan has been dispersed. And I'm nervous about missing the deadline or not being aware of the timing and not keeping well enough track of my obligation to submit the PPP Loan Forgiveness Act. And so I was just wondering about VCLF, what you see your role being in, like, maybe flagging me or tapping my shoulder or something regarding doing that repayment, and or suggestions to make sure that I actually get it done in time when the shop is insane in the middle of summer. Or
Yeah,
autumn, actually, for me.
No, that's awesome news that you guys are doing great. I do just want to clarify that 8 to 24 week period is supposed to be the time when you were using your loan. So once that loan ends up running out, you actually have a 10-month period between, again, when the loan runs out and then when you would have to start making repayments on it. Again, since most of us, or since most businesses that VCLF worked with ended up signing off on a 24-week cover period, you honestly could have something like, I don't want to put myself on the spot here for math, but something like 15 months or so from when you receive the loan to when you would need to apply for forgiveness. So you do have a pretty big window that'll easily stretch into this winter. VCLF is happy to be as hands-on or not as everybody kind of feels they need. again, a lot of the information we already have on hand, so we can easily provide you with. And assuming you have a copy of the initial loan application yourself, you probably also have it all on hand too, outside of the PPP and the SBA and the lender's PPP loan numbers. We do recommend just maybe setting a calendar reminder 6 months out from now to go ahead and follow up. I have a feeling though, VCLF, if we don't end up hearing back from a bunch of lenders after that 10-week period kind of starts to come to a close, might reach out to you, see how you're doing, see if you need any help. And again, we'd be happy to lend a hand in that case. No problem, Laura. All right, I'm not seeing any other hands going up right now. So yeah, again, feel free to reach out to me directly, or honestly, any member of VCLF. I'm sure you'll end up being redirected to the right place. Thanks again, though, for taking the time, and I hope everybody ends up having a great weekend.
Yeah, I hope so too. And just like we said earlier, just be on the lookout for a link to both the transcript and the video as well in the next couple of days. I guess that's everything. So yeah, have a great weekend, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.